That's me, eh?
A black hotel maid answered a call in Dutch. The millionaire thought she'd be fired. Until he asked to see her. The moment that changed everything. Naomi Carter, invisible in her maid's uniform, answers a desperate Dutch phone call in a penthouse suite, unaware that Richard Van Holtz, the billionaire hotel owner, is watching from the doorway. Her flawless linguistic skill triggers immediate consequences, Margaret Frost's fury and Van Holtz's quiet interest. 4 years earlier, Naomi Carter had walked through the bronze doors of the Mondrian Grand Hotel with her Howard University diplomas carefully tucked in her portfolio and hope burning bright in her chest. She'd worn her best interview suit, charcoal gray, perfectly pressed, and carried letters of recommendation from professors who'd called her linguistic abilities, once in a generation. 7 languages. 2 degrees. A thesis on cross-cultural negotiation that had earned departmental honors. Margaret Frost had looked at her resume for exactly 47 seconds before sliding it back across the desk. "We don't have any openings in guest relations at the moment," she'd said, her smile thin as paper. "But we do need housekeeping staff. It's a foot in the door. You can transfer later." The word "later" had hung in the air like a promise that was already a lie. Naomi had told herself it was temporary. She'd filled out the first transfer application after 6 months, as soon as the employee handbook said she was eligible. The response came back stamped with a single word: denied, insufficient experience. She'd applied again at 1 year. Denied, departmental needs. At 18 months. Denied, performance concerns, though her evaluations were flawless. At 2 years, she'd stopped getting written responses at all. Her application simply vanished into the administrative void, swallowed by a system designed to keep her exactly where she was. The microaggressions became routine architecture. Frost calling her "girl," despite Naomi being 31. Guests speaking to her slowly, as if the uniform erased her intellect. Colleagues asking her to translate their Spanish soap operas during lunch, never imagining she understood every word they whispered about her. The way managers looked through her in meetings, their eyes sliding past as if she were furniture. Then her mother's diagnosis arrived like a second prison sentence. Stage 3 breast cancer. The treatments were experimental, expensive, and her mother's insurance covered barely half. Naomi calculated the math with brutal clarity: she needed this job. The benefits. The steady paycheck. Walking away meant watching her mother die. So she stayed, and the turquoise uniform became more than fabric, it became her identity, her cage, the only version of herself the world was willing to see. The morning after the phone call, Naomi found the new assignment sheet taped to her locker. Her name had been moved from the penthouse suites to Zone D, underground parking garage and staff facilities. The handwriting was Margaret Frost's, sharp, angular, unmistakable. Effective immediately, Frost announced during the morning briefing, her voice carrying across the break room with performative authority. Due to certain boundary violations, Miss Carter will be reassigned to deep cleaning duties. She didn't specify which boundaries. She didn't need to. Everyone understood the unspoken rules: know your place, stay invisible, never remind anyone you're more than the uniform suggests. The parking garage reeked of oil and exhaust. Naomi spent 6 hours scrubbing tire marks from concrete, her knees aching, her yellow gloves turning black with grime. The staff bathrooms were worse, deliberately neglected, designed to humiliate. This wasn't discipline. It was punishment for the crime of being competent in the wrong moment. But something unexpected happened during her exile to the hotel's underbelly. Other voices began to whisper. "They did the same thing to me," said Maria, a housekeeper who cleaned the 4th floor. She glanced around before continuing, her voice low. "I have an MBA. Applied for the events coordinator position 3 times. Frost told me I wasn't management material." In the maintenance corridor, Naomi met James, a black engineer who'd graduated from MIT. He'd been fixing toilets for 2 years despite applying repeatedly for the facility's director position. They hired Frost's nephew instead, he said bitterly. Kid barely finished community college. Then there was Aisha, working laundry despite her culinary degree from Le Cordon Bleu. I asked to stage in the restaurant kitchen. Just to observe. Winters himself denied it. Said I needed to prove my commitment first. 4 people. 4 advanced degrees. 4 systematic rejections. The pattern wasn't coincidence, it was architecture, carefully constructed to keep certain people in certain places. And for the first time since putting on the turquoise uniform, Naomi realized she wasn't trapped alone. They'd built a prison, yes. But they'd filled it with people who knew exactly how to dismantle it from the inside. The envelope appeared in Naomi's locker 3 days after the phone call, conspicuous in its formality. Heavy cream cardstock. No hotel letterhead. Inside, a handwritten note in precise European script, Penthouse Suite 4201. 3 p.m. Come as you are. RVH. Her hands trembled as she read it. Richard Van Holtz. The owner. The witness. This was it, the termination she'd been expecting, delivered with the kind of personal attention usually reserved for executives. She'd be escorted out quietly, efficiently, her employment file stamped with whatever vague infraction would ensure she'd never work in hospitality again. Her mother's treatments, the insurance, everything, gone. She arrived at 2:58, still wearing her uniform and yellow gloves because the note had said, "Come as you are," and she had no idea what that meant. The penthouse suite door was already open. Van Holtz sat at a mahogany desk position before floor-to-ceiling windows, the city sprawling behind him like a kingdom. He was younger than she'd imagined from the distant photographs, mid-40s, sharp-featured, with the kind of stillness that came from absolute confidence. On the desk before him, her employment file, thick and worn. Her Howard transcripts. And a stack of papers she recognized immediately, her transfer applications, all 9 of them, each stamped, denied. Naomi Carter, he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. His accent carried the distinctive cadence of Amsterdam, formal but not cold. Please, sit. She remained standing, her posture rigid with defensive pride. If you're going to fire me, I'd prefer to hear it quickly. Fired? His eyebrows rose slightly. Why would I fire my best translator? He tapped the transfer applications. 4 years. 9 requests to guest relations. Every single one rejected for reasons that are, he selected the word carefully, fantasival. Imaginative. You applied for a position requiring fluency in 3 European languages. You speak 7. You were denied 4, insufficient qualifications. The absurdity hung in the air between them. Then he spoke in Dutch, the shift so seamless it took her breath away. Waarom ben je gebleven? Why did you stay? A woman with your credentials could work anywhere. The UN, embassies. International firms. Yet you've spent 4 years scrubbing floors. Why? The question hit harder than any accusation. Because it forced her to admit the truth she'd been avoiding. She'd stayed because leaving felt like surrender, and staying felt like survival, even though both were just different forms of drowning. My mother, Naomi said finally, the words raw. She has cancer. I need the insurance. Van Holtz nodded slowly, as if she'd confirmed something he'd already suspected. Then let's discuss how I can help you keep it. And how you can help me solve a very expensive problem. Van Holtz pulled a folder from his desk drawer, this one labeled in red, Project Benelux Integration, Critical Status. He slid it across to Naomi. 72 hours from now, I'm supposed to finalize a merger between my Dutch holdings, Belgian manufacturing partners, and American investment groups. 200 million euros. 18 months of negotiations. And as of this morning, it's collapsing. He opened the folder to reveal a mess of correspondence, emails marked urgent, contract drafts covered in conflicting revisions, and a particularly alarming message from the Belgian CEO threatening to withdraw. The problem is communication. Not just language, anyone can translate words. The problem is understanding. Cultural context. The difference between what's said and what's meant. My current translator is technically competent but contextually illiterate. She's creating misunderstandings faster than we can repair them. Van Holtz leaned back in his chair, his gaze assessing. 3 days ago, I watched you navigate a complex medical emergency in Dutch with a vocabulary that included technical insurance terminology and regional dialect. You didn't just translate, you understood. Naomi's mind raced ahead, seeing the trap before he sprung it. You want me to replace your translator? For 3 days. In the middle of a €200 million negotiation. I want you to save it, he corrected. The preliminary meetings start tomorrow morning. The final signing is Friday evening. 3 days of technical negotiations, cultural facilitation, and diplomatic interpretation. He named a figure that made her breath catch. €15,000. Paid immediately. Enough to cover 6 months of your mother's treatments. It was more money than she'd make in 8 months of housekeeping. It was salvation and disaster wrapped together. What's the catch? The catch is that my operations director, Gerald Winters, controls all external vendor contracts. He selected the current translator, a woman named Rebecca Walsh, and he's very invested in her success. If I openly replace her with a housekeeping employee, he'll see it as a challenge to his authority. The board will question my judgment. Walsh will file grievances. It will become complicated. Van Holtz met her eyes directly. So you'll do both jobs. Continue your housekeeping duties where visible. Attend the negotiations in professional capacity where needed. No one can know except us. You want me to live a double life for 3 days. I want you to be exactly what you are, overqualified, underestimated, and willing to work twice as hard as anyone else because you've had to your entire life. He pushed a contract across the desk. The question is whether you're willing to do it one more time, but for yourself this time. Naomi stared at the paper, at the number that represented her mother's life measured in medical bills and treatment cycles. She thought of Maria and James and Aisha, trapped in the same invisible architecture. She thought of 9 rejected applications and 4 years of deliberate suppression. I'll do it, she said, reaching for the pen. But when this is over, I want to know why all those transfers were denied. And who denied them? Van Holtz's expression shifted into something that might have been respect. When this is over, Miss Carter, I suspect you'll have all the answers you need. The preliminary meeting started at 9 a.m. in the Vermeer conference room, named for the Dutch master whose reproduction hung over the mahogany credenza. Naomi had spent the previous night reviewing the merger documents Van Holtz provided, her hotel-issued tablet glowing in the darkness of her studio apartment as she absorbed liability clauses, valuation metrics, and the delicate power dynamics between 3 corporate cultures that spoke different languages in more ways than one. She'd arrived at 6 a.m. to complete her housekeeping rounds on the executive floor, her uniform and yellow gloves the armor of invisibility. At 8:45, she slipped into the service corridor behind the conference room, a liminal space where the hotel's beautiful facade gave way to concrete and fluorescent lighting. She changed quickly, the turquoise uniform replaced by a charcoal suit she'd kept from her Howard days, her hair pulled back professionally, her posture shifting from deference to authority. The transformation took 4 minutes. The psychological shift took longer. The meeting room hummed with tension. Dutch executives from Van Holtz's Rotterdam holdings sat on one side, speaking in rapid-fire Netherlands Dutch. Belgian manufacturers occupied the opposite end, their Flemish-accented French carrying notes of irritation. The Americans, 3 investment bankers from New York, looked increasingly uncomfortable in the middle. And at the head of the table, Rebecca Walsh translated with the confidence of someone who didn't realize she was failing. They're concerned about the production timeline, Walsh said, gesturing vaguely toward the Belgian contingent. But the Belgians had actually said something far more specific. They were concerned about contractual penalties if the Americans imposed unreasonable quality standards that violated established European manufacturing protocols. Naomi documented the mistranslation in her notes. Then the next one. And the next. Walsh was simplifying complex financial terminology, flattening cultural nuance into generic corporate speak, and most dangerously, missing the subtext entirely. When the Dutch CEO said the proposal was interesting, Walsh translated it as enthusiasm. Naomi knew better. In Dutch business culture, interesting often meant, I have serious concerns I'm too polite to voice directly. By 10:30, the American lead investor was visibly frustrated. I don't understand why they keep circling back to the quality standards. We've addressed this. Walsh, are you sure you're translating correctly? Walsh's composure cracked slightly. Of course. Perhaps the issue is that they're not being clear. The issue, Naomi said, stepping forward from her position near the door where she'd been standing invisibly, is that Article 4.7 in the contract uses the phrase industry standard protocols. In American legal context, that's flexible. In European manufacturing context, particularly Belgian, it's a reference to specific ISO certifications. They're not being unclear, there's a gap in definition that creates liability exposure. The room went silent. Van Holtz, seated at the far end, showed no reaction, but Naomi could feel his attention sharpen. The Dutch CEO leaned forward, addressing Naomi directly in Dutch. You understand the ISO concern? Ja, Naomi replied in his language. And I understand why your legal team flagged it. The Americans aren't trying to impose unreasonable standards, they simply don't realize you're working from a different regulatory framework. The solution is to specify which ISO certifications apply and who bears the cost of additional compliance. She watched his expression shift from frustration to relief, the recognition of being truly understood. Beside her, Rebecca Walsh's face had gone pale. Who are you? The American banker asked. Van Holtz stood smoothly. This is Miss Carter, a linguistic consultant I've brought in to assist with technical accuracy. Miss Walsh remains lead translator, but Miss Carter will provide cultural context where needed. The lie was so smooth it almost sounded like truth. For the next 3 hours, Naomi operated in the shadows, clarifying, contextualizing, preventing small misunderstandings from becoming deal-breaking crises. Walsh handled the surface translations with increasing stiffness while Naomi caught the errors before they metastasized. It was exhausting, working twice as hard to do someone else's job while remaining invisible enough not to threaten the fiction. At 1 p.m., she slipped back into the service corridor and changed into her turquoise uniform. Margaret Frost was waiting at the service elevator, her expression venomous with suspicion. Where have you been, Carter? Your 12:30 room check was missed. I was restocking the executive floor supply closet, Naomi lied, her voice returning to the deferential tone she'd perfected over 4 years. It took longer than expected. Frost's eyes narrowed, but she had no proof. Don't let it happen again. And you're due in the parking garage at 2 o'clock. Someone spilled oil in Section C. Naomi nodded, pulled on her yellow gloves, and descended into the hotel's underbelly. She had 6 hours before the next negotiation session. 6 hours to scrub oil stains while her mind replayed contract clauses and cultural nuances. 6 hours to live in two worlds that should never have been separated in the first place. By Friday, she thought either she'd expose the system that had trapped her, or it would crush her completely. There was no longer any middle ground. The second day of negotiations revealed a pattern Naomi couldn't ignore. Rebecca Walsh wasn't just incompetent, she was deliberately sloppy, as if she knew her position was protected regardless of performance. Every mistranslation Naomi corrected seemed to irritate Walsh more than embarrass her, and by the afternoon session, Walsh had stopped even pretending to listen to Naomi's suggestions. During a 15-minute break, Naomi found herself in the executive corridor outside the payroll office, still wearing her housekeeping uniform. A voice called out softly, "You're the one Van Holtz brought in, aren't you?" The woman was perhaps 40, Latina, with sharp eyes behind modest glasses. Her badge read, Elena Martinez, payroll specialist. She gestured Naomi into the small office and closed the door. "I was a lawyer," Elena said without preamble. "Immigration law. I applied for the legal compliance position here 2 years ago. Overqualified, 3 interviews, perfect fit. They hired an external candidate with half my experience." She pulled up a file on her computer screen. "Then I started noticing things. Transfer requests that disappeared. Performance reviews that contradicted supervisors' verbal feedback. Always the same names on the rejection signatures, Margaret Frost. Gerald Winters." Naomi's breath caught. "You kept records?" "I'm in payroll. I see everything eventually." Elena pulled up another file, vendor contracts. "Including this. Rebecca Walsh, Expert Translation Services LLC. She's been on contract for 8 months at $500 per hour. 20 hours per week, every week, whether there's international business or not." Elena's expression hardened. "I ran the numbers. The hotel has paid her over $80,000. For a position you applied for. Repeatedly. Why would Winters protect her specifically?" Elena clicked to another document, a property deed. "Because Rebecca Walsh lives at 1247, Riverside Drive, Unit 12B. So does Gerald Winters. Different mailing addresses on the employment forms, but same utility accounts. She's his mistress, Naomi. And he's been blocking qualified internal candidates, you, me, probably dozens of others, to funnel money to her through fraudulent consulting fees." Naomi felt the architecture of her oppression suddenly crystallize into something tangible, provable. "How much total?" Elena's fingers flew across the keyboard. "Translation services, cultural consultation, international liaison fees. All paid to Walsh or her LLC. Some going back 3 years, even before you applied." She turned the screen toward Naomi. $417,000. The number was staggering. That was embezzlement on a scale that wouldn't just end careers, it could mean criminal charges. But it also meant Winters had enormous incentive to protect his scheme, which meant he'd fight viciously against anyone who threatened to expose it. "We need more than financial records," Naomi said, her mind racing through legal standards of evidence from her Howard classes. "We need the personnel files. Proof that qualified candidates were systematically rejected while Walsh was hired. I can't access HR files without authorization." "But..." Elena glanced toward the door, calculating risks. "Zara Williams in Human Resources. She's been here 12 years. She might remember your applications. And she hates Winters, he tried to force her to falsify a harassment complaint last year." 20 minutes later, Naomi stood in a dusty records room with Elena and Zara, pulling files that painted a devastating picture. 9 transfer applications from Naomi Carter, each marked "denied" with increasingly flimsy justifications. 6 applications from Maria Gonzalez for events coordination. 4 from James Chen for facilities management. 7 from Aisha Rahman for culinary positions. Every single one rejected by Winters or Frost, often with identical boilerplate language. But the smoking gun was in the comparison files, the candidates who were approved. White employees with fewer qualifications, shorter tenure, weaker performance reviews. Frost's nephew, hired as assistant facilities director despite failing the basic licensing exam. Walsh herself, contracted for translation despite having no verifiable credentials beyond a bachelor's degree in marketing. "This is systematic discrimination," Zara said quietly. "And we've been enabling it because the denials looked legitimate individually. It's only when you see them all together that the pattern becomes undeniable." Naomi photographed every document with her phone, her hand steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. This was bigger than her job, bigger than the merger. This was evidence of a machine designed to keep people like her invisible, and she'd just found the blueprint. Elena, can you pull Walsh's actual work product? Anything that shows the quality of her translations? Elena smiled grimly. Already did. I have emails from 3 international partners complaining about mistranslations. Winters buried them all. They had everything they needed. The question now was whether Van Holtz would use it, and whether Winters would destroy them before they had the chance to present it. The third morning began with a summons to Margaret Frost's office. Naomi found her supervisor seated behind her desk with the satisfied expression of a predator who'd finally cornered her prey. Gerald Winters stood behind her, silver-haired and immaculate in his tailored suit. Miss Carter, Frost began, her voice dripping with false formality, it's come to our attention that you've been abandoning your assigned duties. Multiple missed room checks. Extended absences from your posted zones. Unauthorized access to administrative areas. She slid a disciplinary form across the desk, already filled out. This constitutes grounds for immediate termination. Naomi's pulse spiked, but she kept her voice level. I've completed every task assigned to me. Have you? Winters interjected smoothly. Because we have time-stamped security logs showing you entering restricted areas during working hours. The payroll office. The HR records room. Care to explain what housekeeping business you had there? They'd been watching her. The realization hit like ice water, of course they had. The moment she'd started asking questions, she'd painted a target on her back. Winters wasn't just protecting his scheme, he was actively hunting threats to it. I want to speak with Mr. Van Holtz, Naomi said. Frost laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. Mr. Van Holtz doesn't involve himself in departmental discipline. Sign the form, clear out your locker, and leave quietly. Or we'll have security escort you out and flag your file to ensure you never work in this industry again. Naomi stared at the paper. 1 signature and 4 years of swallowed pride, blocked opportunities, and systematic humiliation would end with nothing to show for it. Her mother's insurance would disappear. The evidence she'd gathered would be buried. And Winters would continue his scheme, trapping the next qualified person who made the mistake of hoping for more. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a text from Van Holtz, don't sign anything. Stall. I'd like to consult with a lawyer before signing any termination documents, Naomi said, her voice steady. That's my right under company policy. Winters' expression hardened. You're not entitled to legal counsel for a standard disciplinary action. Then I'm not signing. Fire me if you want, but I'm not making it easy for you. Frost's face flushed red. You arrogant. That's enough, Van Holtz's voice cut through the room like a blade. He stood in the doorway, his presence commanding immediate attention. Miss Carter is correct. Any termination without legal review violates company policy. I'm overriding this action pending investigation. With respect, Mr. Van Holtz, Winters said, his tone careful but challenging, you're undermining departmental authority. The board won't appreciate executive interference in routine personnel matters. Then I'll explain it to the board personally. Dismissed. Van Holtz held the door open, making it clear the conversation was over. But as Naomi left, she caught Winters' expression, cold calculation replacing anger. He wasn't backing down. He was adapting. That afternoon, during the final merger negotiation preparation, Naomi reviewed the contract draft one last time. Something felt wrong. She pulled up the liability clause, Article 7.3, Environmental Damages and Remediation Responsibilities. The Dutch version and English version should have been mirrors. Instead, they were opposites. The English assigned environmental liability to the Belgian manufacturers. The Dutch version, the one Van Holtz would sign, assigned it to his company. 100 million euros in potential exposure, hidden in a single mistranslation. Rebecca Walsh hadn't made a mistake. She'd planted a bomb. Naomi's hands shook as she highlighted the discrepancy. Tomorrow was the signing ceremony. International executives, board members, and press would attend. If Van Holtz signed that contract, it would be legally binding, and it would transfer catastrophic liability to his holdings while enriching the exact partners Winters needed to protect his scheme. This wasn't just about blocking her anymore. Winters was willing to destroy the entire company to cover his tracks. And he'd weaponized Walsh to do it. The signing ceremony transformed the grand ballroom into theater. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across round tables where international executives sat in carefully choreographed positions. The Dutch delegation occupied the north side, Belgian representatives the south, American investors the center. Press photographers positioned themselves along the perimeter, ready to capture the moment a €200 million merger became official. Naomi stood at the back of the room in her turquoise uniform and yellow gloves, restocking water glasses at the beverage station. Invisible. Exactly as she'd been for 4 years, exactly as Winters needed her to remain for the next 10 minutes. The contract sat on the central table, projected simultaneously on screens throughout the room, English on the left, Dutch on the right. Van Holtz approached the table with the Dutch CEO, both men carrying fountain pens for the traditional signing. Photographers raised their cameras. Naomi's eyes locked on Article 7.3 projected above them. The mistranslation glowed like a wound, Miljuskade Vergoeding, assigned to Van Holtz Holdings, in the Dutch text, while the English clearly stated Belgian manufacturing partners. €100 million in liability, deliberately reversed. She had perhaps 30 seconds before signatures made it permanent. Every instinct screamed at her to stay silent. Speaking up meant exposing herself in front of international press, board members, and executives who'd never looked at her twice. It meant confirming Winters' accusations that she'd overstepped her position. It meant painting an even larger target on her back for a system designed to destroy people who challenged it. But staying silent meant watching Van Holtz sign a poison contract. It meant letting Winters win. It meant every blocked transfer, every humiliation, every qualified person trapped in the wrong job, all of it would continue, validated by her complicity. Naomi set down her water pitcher. Her hands stripped off the yellow gloves with deliberate precision. And she walked forward. The room's ambient noise dimmed as people registered the anomaly, a maid approaching the signing table. Van Holtz looked up, his expression carefully neutral. The Dutch CEO paused, pen hovering over paper. Neemt u mij niet kwalijk, Naomi said in perfect Dutch, her voice carrying across the ballroom. Excuse me. Before you sign, there's a critical error in Article 7.3 that requires immediate attention. The room erupted in confused murmurs. Winters rose from his seat at the executive table, his face draining of color. Margaret Frost looked like she might physically drag Naomi away. The Dutch CEO's eyebrows rose. He responded in Dutch, his tone sharp with suspicion. Who are you? My name is Naomi Carter. I'm a linguistic specialist. Mr. Van Holtz consulted for this negotiation. The liability clause for environmental damages has been mistranslated. In the English version, responsibility is assigned to Belgian manufacturing partners. In the Dutch version you're about to sign, it's assigned to Van Holtz Holdings. The discrepancy creates a €100 million liability transfer that I don't believe was your intention. The Belgian CEO stood abruptly, demanding his own translator verify the claim. Rebecca Walsh attempted to interject, insisting the translation was correct, but the Dutch CEO had already pulled his copy of the contract closer, comparing the versions line by line. His expression shifted from suspicion to fury. Dit is geen fout. Dit is fraude. This isn't a mistake. This is fraud. The room exploded into controlled chaos. Executives demanded explanations in 3 languages simultaneously. Photographers captured everything, their flash units firing like small explosions. Lawyers materialized from the sides of the room, converging on the table to examine the contracts. Van Holtz's voice cut through the noise, commanding in its calm. The signing is postponed. All parties will reconvene tomorrow morning after a full legal review. He gestured toward Naomi. Miss Carter, my office. Now. As she followed him out, she caught Winter's expression, no longer calculating but cornered, a predator who just realized the trap had closed around him instead. The emergency board meeting convened in the executive conference room at 7 a.m., before most of the hotel staff arrived. Naomi sat beside Van Holtz at the long table, no longer wearing her turquoise uniform but a borrowed suit from the hotel boutique. Across from her, 3 board members, the company's general counsel, and a visibly shaken Gerald Winters. Margaret Frost had been barred from the meeting entirely. Elena Martinez sat at the end of the table with her laptop, the files she'd compiled open and ready. The evidence was overwhelming, organized into 3 categories: financial fraud, systematic discrimination, and contractual sabotage. Van Holtz spoke first, his tone carrying the weight of absolute authority. Yesterday, we nearly signed a contract that would have exposed this company to catastrophic liability due to deliberate mistranslation. Miss Carter prevented a €100 million disaster. The question now is how that mistranslation occurred, and what other damage has been done. Elena projected the first document, Rebecca Walsh's payment history. Over 3 years, the hotel has paid Walsh's consulting company $417,000 for translation services. During that same period, 9 qualified internal candidates applied for similar positions. Every application was rejected, despite superior credentials. The screen shifted to Naomi's transfer applications, then Maria's, James's, Aisha's. The pattern was undeniable. Each rejection signed by Winters or Frost. Each replaced by external contracts or unqualified internal promotions. Mr. Winters, the general counsel said carefully, these documents show a clear pattern of discrimination in hiring and promotion practices. They also show significant payments to a vendor with questionable credentials. Can you explain? Winters leaned back, attempting composure. Rebecca Walsh is a qualified translator. The payments were for legitimate services. As for the transfer denials, those were based on operational needs and performance assessments. Were they? Naomi opened her own file, pulling up the emails Elena had found. Because here are 3 separate complaints from international partners about mistranslations. Here's the Amsterdam Conference Center reporting a failed negotiation due to communication errors. Here's the Belgian consortium threatening to withdraw from preliminary talks because they felt culturally misunderstood. All of these occurred under Walsh's contract. All were buried by your office without investigation. She pulled up the final document, the property records showing Walsh and Winters' shared address. Rebecca Walsh isn't just unqualified. She's your mistress. You've been embezzling consultation fees by blocking qualified internal candidates and funneling contracts to someone with a personal relationship to you. Yesterday's mistranslation wasn't incompetence, it was deliberate sabotage to protect your scheme when Miss Carter got too close to exposing it. The room went silent. One of the board members stood, her expression glacial. Mr. Winters, you're suspended immediately pending criminal investigation. Security will escort you out. Margaret Frost is terminated effective immediately for complicity in discriminatory practices. Winters opened his mouth to object, then seemed to understand the futility. He left with security, his silver hair and tailored suit suddenly looking like costume rather than armor. The board chair turned to Naomi. Miss Carter, we owe you an apology. And compensation for what you've endured. Mr. Van Holtz has proposed promoting you to Director of International Guest Relations, effective immediately. But I'd like to hear what you want. Naomi glanced at Elena, then at the files on the screen, evidence of dozens of trapped, invisible people. I want the promotion. But I want something else more. I want a comprehensive audit of every employee's credentials and every blocked transfer request from the past 5 years. I want a program that ensures this never happens again, one that actively searches for invisible talent and removes the barriers that keep qualified people trapped in wrong positions. And I want the authority to implement it. 6 months later, Naomi stood in the same boardroom, now furnished with her own nameplate, Naomi Carter, Chief Diversity Officer. Before her sat representatives from major hotel chains across 3 continents, all invited to learn about the Hidden Potential Initiative. We identified 47 employees whose credentials exceeded their positions, she explained, projecting the statistics. 12 have been promoted internally. 8 have been sponsored for additional certifications. 23 have been placed in positions that match their education and skills. Among them, Maria Gonzalez, now Director of International Events. James Chen, Vice President of Facilities and Engineering. Elena Martinez, Director of Human Resources. The transformation wasn't just numerical. It was cultural. The hotel had implemented blind promotion reviews, mandatory credentials audits, and a whistleblower protection system for discrimination complaints. Other companies were taking notice. The model was spreading. In the front row, Naomi's mother sat watching, her headscarf gone and her hair growing back after successful treatment. Beside her, Aisha, now executive sous chef, Maria, already planning a TEDx talk, James, designing sustainable building systems for the hotel's expansion. On Naomi's office wall hung a frame containing her old turquoise uniform and a single yellow glove. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Talent had no uniform. Potential had no appearance. And justice required those with power to look beyond the surface and see what had always been there, waiting to be recognized. The invisible revolution had begun. And it was only getting started.